Let us talk first of all about the state of play, because I was sort of musing over the course of the weekend where lots of pieces being written about how badly wrong Sage got it, how all of their doomsday predictions didn't come true. And I thought to myself, well, Chris Whitty was right in there with the best of them, talking about tsunamis of infection. Boris Johnson was talking about tidal waves of infection. It has turned out, thankfully, we should say, that Omicron apparently is a much less harmful form of the virus. The South Africans all the way through were saying, we don't know why Britain is getting so carried away with this. I mean, should it not be the case that at the very least Chris Whitty is asked to come before the beak, as it were, with his slides and with his lectern, and he stands there and he explains how he managed to get it so wrong?
I think it would be a good thing. I think a lot of people have distinguished themselves by exaggeration in the past couple of years, and their exaggerations have cost the country a great deal in terms of, amongst other things, missed medical treatment for non-COVID illnesses. And I really would like to see some sort of admission that this has been overdone, and this in particular has so swiftly proved to be mistaken exaggeration, that the sooner people put it right, the better. And people do make mistakes. I'm not generally in favour of demanding that people be removed from their posts or stuff like that. People do make mistakes, and the way in which they then distinguish themselves is by saying, well, look, yes, I'm sorry, I was wrong, and I will try not to do it again. And if people do that, which is generally an act of both courage and good manners, I'm prepared to say, good, right. So let's have a bit of contrition among the people who tried to make out that this was a terrible threat. And that would be a good thing. There does seem to me very slowly to be an awakening from the sleep of reason which gripped the thinking and media classes of this country nearly 2 years ago. People are beginning to say, well, hang on a minute, maybe the Great Barrington Declaration had a point. Maybe targeted action would have worked better. Or alternatively to say, maybe there isn't any evidence that lockdowns did any particular good, because if you look at the whole world, you won't find any congruence between the severity of lockdown and the number of deaths. So I just feel any opportunity to get people to think, to accept that they may have been mistaken, has to be a good thing. And I very much hope that they do so.
Yes, because we do have a bit of a sort of culture now of making apologies so that they make everything better. And I'm not that keen on that side of things either, because when people make apologies which are clearly just being made for the purpose of staying in a job, I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. But I think
it depends what the terms of it are, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
There's a thing called a non-apology apology, which is quite similar to a non-denial denial. It's dressed up to look like an apology, but isn't it? It usually begins with the words, I am sorry if, and then goes on, if you. Basically, I'm sorry if you were upset by what I said. Well, that's not an apology.
No.
That's something entirely different. So, but a clear recognition. We got this wrong. Everybody gets things wrong. There is no perfect saint among us who never gets anything wrong. We got this wrong. We'll try not to do it again. I would just like to see a lot of that. And also this whole language of misrepresentation, which really needs to be dropped. The fundamental one is the use of the term case to describe a positive test, as if these people were actually ill, which in many cases they weren't. And the other fundamental one is, which is now at last undergoing some scrutiny, is the previous insistence that anybody who was detected with a COVID positive test must or died having contracted COVID, had died because they had COVID, or were in hospital because they had COVID. Whereas in so many cases, they were in hospital for other reasons, and they died for a multiplicity of reasons, which might have included COVID, but wouldn't necessarily be right to say it was the real reason. This kind of frankly, confusing the public with things presented as if they were clear facts when they're actually much more complicated, has to come to an end for us to get back to some sense. And the whole obsession with testing that has gripped us now for 2 years. If you search for people who will test positive for COVID, you'll get them. If you don't search, you won't. What previous civilization has gone around spending billions in public money looking for people who are technically ill but actually aren't? if they're ill, they can say so. They
Yeah.
can tell their doctors.
And is there, do you think, a sort of philosophy behind all of this? Because I was talking to Sir Hugh Pennington, who's one of the relatively sensible professors up in Aberdeen, about this whole situation. And he said, well, of course, you know, the government's job and the NHS's job is to try and prevent those deaths which are preventable. To which I said, well, the week ending December the 24th, 2021, week 51 on the calendar, there were 828 deaths from COVID. There were 13,000 deaths plus altogether in that week. And it just seems to me that 6.5% of any total is a very small number.
Well, it's also, if that's their concern, why is it devoted solely to COVID anyway?
Right.
If this government were really as concerned about saving life as it claims to be, it would, for instance, have much stricter efforts to discourage people from smoking cigarettes. And it would also be trying a great deal harder to reduce the carnage on the roads. And it has done quite a bit in both of those, but it hasn't done anything like what it's done in its attempts to prevent the spread of COVID, which I have to say has also largely failed. And if they really are that concerned to save all the lives they could possibly save, there are many other things which they could actually do quite effectively, which would save, I think, more lives, and more lives at a younger stage too. So if that really is what they mean, then let them show it in all aspects of medical treatment, and particularly in the most effective form of medical treatment of all, the prevention of disease by public health education, and by encouraging particularly the thing which is incredibly beneficial to health in this country, namely exercise, which at the moment millions of people simply don't do, and as a result they contract terrible amounts of illness because of it. We do nothing about that by comparison. If we did those things as intensively as we've conducted the anti-COVID campaign, I believe them that was their main concern. But the funny thing about COVID is it gives people the opportunity to boss us around, confine us in our homes, and tell us to stop going to work, take control over the economy and politics in a way never previously seen outside wartime. And that seems to me to be why it attracts certain people.
Well, that's right. I mean, just looking at the Novak Djokovic case, I don't know what side of the fence you're on there, but I was talking to somebody over the weekend who said, you know, one thing that we have learned through this pandemic is that basically governments can do anything. You know, when they used to in the past say, oh, we can't do that, or, you know, that's too expensive, or, you know, people would never stand for that. We now know that basically they can do anything they want.
Well, it certainly looks like it, doesn't it? I mean, I'm not particularly interested in sports. I barely knew who Novak Djokovic was before a couple of weeks ago. But it does seem to me that he went through quite a lot of detailed discussions with the Australian tennis authorities and the Australian migration authorities before he arrived.
Yeah. And
that the way he was treated begins to look rather shocking. And the initial response of the authorities, I mean, the last I heard after the government's case against him seems to have collapsed in a hearing, was one of sort of petulance. Either he's allowed in or he's not. Either the fact that he's actually had the disease counts or it doesn't. And if the authorities said before that it did, then surely they must stick to that, or the whole thing is completely lawless.
right.
I do think there's something really peculiar going on here, and I don't want to take any side in something which I'm not totally and utterly briefed on, but you just feel again that authority is being used with a kind of self-righteousness and an unwillingness to be questioned, which really shouldn't be tolerated in a free society.
No, it really shouldn't. And interestingly, I mean, an awful lot of the people in Australia themselves had said, well, we don't want him coming in because, you know, why should the rules be different for him than they are for us? And by the same token, you get that same kind of attitude that you get from some people in this country who say, who talk about the vaccines as if they're some kind of silver bullet, when they're clearly not, you know, as if to say that anyone who doesn't have it is in some way dangerous. And there is also this kind of pervasive, rather unpleasant stream of consciousness which is going on in all countries about people who are, for whatever reason, deciding not to take the vaccination.
Well, one of the great joys of life is disapproving of other people, and you can generally get a pretty good following by encouraging others to disapprove of other people. And one of the other great joys of life is telling people they're wrong. And this seems to combine here into a wonderful streak of new style Puritanism, where millions of people can look down on their neighbours for not having done the right thing.
Yeah.
And tell them that they're wrong. So you can see why it catches on, can't you?
Well, I suppose so, but it's unpleasant, and I wish it wouldn't.
It's very unpleasant, but there it is. It is what people don't admit to a lot of the things they enjoy. But disapproving of other people is something people enjoy a lot.
Yes. Lots of people disapproved last week of the decision by the jury in Bristol, which I know you wrote about this weekend, and you took an interesting kind of opinion on it, as I would expect you to. You're very much in favour of juries.
Well, completely, and without any equivocation. I think that the jury is one of the great protections of liberty in this country, and I only really understood this when I wrote my book, The Abolition of Liberty. Gosh, coming up to 20 years ago, and I looked into this and realised how little I knew. For instance, most people in this country have no idea that hardly anywhere else in the world outside the Anglosphere actually has independent juries at all. They're pretty much unique to the English-speaking countries, and they grant us an amazing thing. In any other country, a trial is an assembly of state officials deciding how guilty you are. In the Anglosphere countries where there are juries, a trial is an actual contest between the defence and the prosecution. So they're saying everyone goes on about how people are presumed innocent until proven guilty. In this country, that is actually true because of the jury. On the continent, it isn't really true. It's true in theory, but in practice, anybody who's accused of a crime is pretty much assumed to have done it. They're usually bunged into prison immediately for long periods of pre-trial detention. They're expected to cooperate with their own prosecution. And the trial is, as I say, an event where the state decides how guilty they are rather than whether there's any question that they might not be. It's very rare for people to get acquitted under these systems. And the great difference this makes is that you can't really have political trials. The government can't use criminal trials to bung its opponents into prison the way it can elsewhere. Now, there's a consequence of this, and it's bound to happen that a fair number of people who are accused of crimes will be acquitted by juries, even though most people think they're guilty. People say, well, that's a pretty high price to pay. I say, I don't agree. Everybody benefits from the immense defence of liberty provided by juries, going back to some amazing trials back in the 17th and 18th centuries where this was established. And we should treasure it. And any attempt to whip the mob up against juries because they come up with the occasional unusual and puzzling verdict seems to me to be very dangerous. We've already lost in this country, thanks to, in my view, foolish public outcry. We've lost the right to silence, which is guaranteed in the American Bill of Rights. And we've lost the very sensible old rule against being tried twice for the same offence, which is a huge protection against oppressive government. But again, because of public outcry, in that case over the Stephen Lawrence case, hard cases make bad law, and they always will. And people should always remember that the jury trial is the key to the true presumption of innocence and the absolute basis of our real liberty. Never, ever let anybody attack it, however much it may cost. The more the verdict disappoints or displeases you, the more careful you should be about this. You have to put up with these things. All principles have costs.